Hello everyone and welcome to the latest episode of the IWFM webinar series, Navigating Turbulent Times. As you can see on your screens there, hopefully, today's episode is about using building energy management systems. Of course, everyone knows what BMS stands for, to create healthy buildings. And we're pleased to actually do this in partnership with one of our partners, Trend. And today we've got a great speaker for you to go actually through this with some actual live examples of creating healthy buildings. Just before we go on to me introducing the speaker, I'm Peter Brogan, Head of Research and Insight at IWFN. I'm sure some of you have seen me on the previous episodes we've conducted, part of our NTT program. Just to make our viewers, listeners aware, we are actually recording this live like the majority of our episodes, so the recording will be made available afterwards. Just to make you aware, we have got a number of polls and dedicated question sections throughout today. That's really to get you engaged in the program and also to help Steve from an engagement point of view, because bless him, Steve's there on his own today. There's no other speakers, so it's just me and Steve. So as you can see on his screens there, hopefully you can see Steve Rainbow, HB Sales Ambassador for Trend Control Systems Limited. So Steve, at this point, rather than, as I say on many of my episodes, that I read a long bio from someone and then realise we're 10 minutes into the episode, be always good just for the listeners, viewers, just to get a bit from the individual themselves, a bit of a background about yourself and what they'd be expecting today on today's episode. So Steve, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for joining this webinar today. So yeah, I'm Steve Rainbow. I work as a key account manager for demand generation team within Trend Controls. And probably 3 months ago, I was given the task of looking into the effect of COVID and getting people back into buildings and back into spaces, and inherited the title of the Healthy Buildings Ambassador for the UK. So we have a team within Honeywell looking at this. This is a global issue. So hopefully today I'm going to explain, the processes and the reasons why and what we're doing to make it a better place for people to go back into in these strange times.
So at this point, Steve, I will hand over to you to go to your presentations. Just to remind people, please send your questions through. As I say, we've got dedicated sections for all the questions, as well as a dedicated section for Q&A at the end. And also we've got some polls, so please get engaged with them. So you hear back from me shortly, but Steve, over to your dear self.
Okay, thank you. So, what is a healthy building? I'm sure we all feel a lot of nervousness at the moment. It's a very strange world, been a very strange year. Personally, I would still be nervous about using public transport. So you can imagine the effect that that's having within buildings. And the general idea is to build some confidence, instill confidence into the people returning to these workspaces, and implementing changes and using the BEMS and technology to give some reassurance that the people returning to these places are returning to the safe, and clean environments, or as safe and as clean as we can possibly get them. So the concerns, so is the environment clean and safe and ready for business? We don't know, because there's no real indicators to say that it is. But if we could relay that information to the entrance to a building or to people's apps or mobile devices, then it would give the reassurance. Are the people actually comfortable? I mentioned a minute ago that I'm nervous myself about using public transport. It's all of the unknown. I'll speak very briefly on the complying with safety policies that will be implemented regarding the PPE, people tracking, people movement, which really falls more into the Honeywell access and security side of the business. And time, we want to look at how quickly we can implement this. Obviously, the beginning of the year, the first lockdown in March, we're now into another lockdown. Who knows when people will be returning? We know a lot of the education, schools, universities went back So, you know, we need to look at time scaling. So basically, the Healthy Buildings Initiative that I've been working on is split into two elements. We have the safety and the security piece, which is, I say there's the section I'll talk about briefly, which talks of people counting, people access, movement, temperature screening automatically. The main piece, obviously, that we're looking at is within the BEMS. So what can we do within the building energy management system to improve the air quality? So I'll go into some detail on why we're doing it and how we're doing it, and hopefully how you can implement changes that are needed to suit the guidance that's out there. So where is this applicable? Where are we looking at, you know, putting any changes in place? There was a big push at first on healthcare, but really anywhere where we have gatherings of people, whether that be airports, office buildings, you know, there's a lot of real estate that is rented space, that we need to implement this. Hospitality, education is obviously key, the schools, the universities, and retail shops. Everywhere that we go, we need to be looking at implementing some changes to the systems and the air that's been put into those spaces and buildings. So this slide's quite detailed. What this one does, it covers the whole solution that Honeywell can provide. The red areas on here, we'll be looking at the access control, CCTV. The orange pieces, they relate to what we would be doing within the trend, within the BEMS world. We're looking at enhanced air quality. Air quality has always been something that we have done, but we've never really had any defined you know, methods of recording and measuring in any detail the air composition. So I'll go into that in a little bit more detail shortly. Even if we were to implement local devices, if we can actually monitor the status of the air and the composition of the air within that space, we can use the system's head end, whether that be a 963 in the old days or IQ Vision, and we can get that information and that data and relay that back, either presenting that as a KPI at the reception of the building or on people's mobile devices. So FM managers will be able to understand what the air quality and the composition of the air against a recognised scale is. Peter, the first poll.
And I think this is my cue to come back. So there you go. I've hit the right button. So as promised, folks, we have got some polls and question sections today. So I'd just like to launch the first poll, which has been launched there. So hopefully you can see the question, and I can see responses coming in, excuse me, in terms of, are you aware of the REHVA ZIPSI guidance recommendations? So you may find more about that later in the episode without spoiler alert, but it'd be interesting to know viewers, listeners, understanding knowledge of those guidance recommendations at the moment. So I just give you a few moments as you lovely people start completing that question, and I know people are still filling it in as I speak. So just give it a couple more seconds. So there's always this eerie moment of how long you leave it for. So we're roughly up to a minute on that. So if we can just close the poll and hopefully can see the results come in.
Okay, that's interesting. That is interesting.
So from my screen there, just to ensure, I've got 37% of the audience indicating yes and 63% indicating no. So Steve, I'm always keen on first reactions, and you've used the word interesting. Was that dangerous when we talk about polls? And yes, this isn't political, you'd be pleased to know. Was that high? Was that the norm, or were you expecting that, or were you
I
very
would have
open-minded?
No, I would have thought that may have been the other way. Obviously, I'm not, I don't know the audience that we have today, their roles, their responsibilities. People I've spoken to over the last few weeks and months about this, some of them are aware, some of are implementing the guidance that's been issued. So it's useful because obviously, as we go through the presentation, I'll be explaining a little more around this guidance that is being issued by these regulatory bodies. So
Yeah, that's great. So Steve, I hand back to you, and as you just mentioned there, for those 63% that indicated no, I think you're about to find out a little bit more about those particular guidance. So over to you, Steve.
Okay, so REHVA, this is the European element involved with defining and advising the health authorities more than anything on what we should be doing. So they're working closely with SIBSI. And if we look at this original guidance, this first one came out April the 3rd. There is another one now that was published in August that will be followed by a later version that's going to be looking at the implications of temperature, as temperature falls outside, implementing their recommendations, what effect that's going to have. So this is the area where you need to be looking for advice. But going way back to the first lockdown, they were advising that we introduce as much outside air as possible. Okay, so it's all about bringing fresh air. I'll go into a bit more detail on why as we move through the presentation. They're saying run the plant for longer. Certainly with toilet ventilation, leave that running for a longer period of time, even 24/7. So we're bringing more fresh air into the spaces as we possibly can. If we move on, this is ISHRAE. So this is the American take on this. I explained this is a global issue. So these governing bodies have all got similar takes. So they said exactly the same. Increase the outside air ventilation, put the recirculation systems into 100% fresh air. They then start talking about introducing a greater level of filtration to MERV 13 or above. Again, we talk about running plant for longer, adding portable room air cleaning devices, introducing UV sterilization devices. Temperature and humidity have been found the set points that we tend to have within the BEMS are acceptable within the current climate. But what they are saying is with some of the energy recovery ventilation, certainly with thermal wheels, the best thing to do with those is to isolate them, because 180 degrees after the return air has hit a thermal wheel, we're blowing that air back into the space, and that could have contamination within it. And then we talk of SIBSI. So SIBSI again are saying exactly the same. Increase the supply air and exhaust ventilation, supplying as much air as reasonably possible. I like to emphasize that word reasonable due to the fact that obviously as outside air temperature falls over the coming weeks, this will be a problem in the Northern Hemisphere, that running plants at 100% fresh air, vent plant, the mechanical services may not be able to cope. However, the SIBSI guidance at the moment and the REHVA guidance is saying run your plant at 100% fresh air. They also confirmed from research that the COVID risks and the airborne risks, there's a lot of documentation you'll find if you go on the internet. It's saying the larger droplets fall to the floor just because of gravity, which that obviously gives us the 2-meter social distancing measure. But however, the finer aerosols can remain airborne for several hours. And again, I'll show you a little bit more about that in the coming slides. The really important piece to get across to everybody here is the fact that I'm not an air composition expert. I'm a controls engineer, and we aren't trying to say we will be getting rid of COVID and neither are SIBSI. But what we are saying is carry out a risk assessment. If you are carrying out a risk assessment relating to PPE and people movement and people counting, you should be doing exactly the same to look at the ventilation systems that you have installed within the building. We can offer, you know, the guidance and support to anybody looking at the BEMS system. But if we start looking at any kind of alterations to ductwork or filtration, then you would need to be talking to, you know, consulting engineers that are experts in that field. That risk assessment is really key. Again, SIBSI are working closely with REHVA, you know, to come up with the best possible solution moving forward.
And this is where I'm back in, Steve. So as promised, to the audience, we're trying to engage. Obviously, there's a lot of information on today's webinar, and we've done it in segments with a dedicated Q&A session at the end. And I would love, as well as Steve, in terms of your questions coming in. I know we've got some questions coming in as we speak, so encourage you just to send your questions in, views, comments. Please send them in as well. We welcome them on the live webinar. But I have had a question in, Steve, and it was quite early on actually in terms of the webinar. And I guess this individual isn't on their own, I'm afraid, that they've had a building that's been unoccupied for most of this year. What should they do, in their words, what should I do to ensure it's safe when we reopen? And I imagine from our audience and those that look back and view this recording may be in a very similar position as we are today. So what's your words of advice about the safetiness and safety when it comes to reopening a building? Where do you start?
The first step would be to seek the advice from the governing bodies that are issuing the guidance. So your REHVAs, your SIBSIs, the government are issuing advice to building owners and facilities managers on what they should be doing. Obviously, then we need to be carrying out this risk assessment that will ascertain, you know, what we have, what we can do relating to the plant that's installed. You know, I had client right at the beginning of lockdown whose estate had to be occupied. It couldn't be closed. So they had to implement some of the changes, the strategy changes I'll talk about in a few moments, right from the onset. But the first step would be to take the guidance from the government and from REHVA, who are advising the government. You know, obviously we're here to help. Any of the SIBSI authorities, certainly consulting engineers, will be able to help and advise people on how to implement what is being asked by this guidance.
Yeah, that's great. And we've had a load of questions come in. They are flooding in as you need one to spiral. So thank you for those that have sent questions in. I'm going to start with Patrick. No favoritism there, Patrick, as my middle name's Patrick. But we've had a question in from Patrick. He's described that I work in a managed building where costs are watched by the landlord's agent. How much should I expect them to follow the REHVA guidance to run vent plant for longer? So how much would you expect the landlord to get involved and to follow the guidance that's been highlighted today, Steve, is essentially Patrick's question.
Okay, I've been asked by landlords exactly that question, and they are following that guidance. I think what you'll be actually looking at here is the fact that because we're now running the systems for longer and with more fresh air, obviously we're going to be using more energy, possibly, you know, and it's the knock-on effect of how, and this is the question that we're looking at the moment with REHVA and SIBSI on how, you know, the landlords are going to pass on, I presume, pass on that cost. But you know, this is key. Certainly, if you imagine London, there's a lot of rented office space in London. People have been working home for the last year. Yeah, these people really need to get their tenants back into those buildings as quickly. So they are very, very keen to implement everything possible to make it as safe as possible, to make the building more appealing to their tenants. To answer your question.
That's great, Stephen. Thank you for those sending questions in. Just to remind people, we are capturing these in the system and can send them on to Steve. I am aware of time, but for this section, I don't want to put people off. We do have other sections dedicated to questions, so I may come back to some. But you did refer to risk assessments through that first stage of the presentation, Steve. And I had a direct question in from Grane. I think that's how you pronounce it. So apologies if I've mispronounced that. Is there a checklist available for risk assessment? So I guess a template, is there a recommendation on that, or do they differ per organisation? So when you're referring to risk assessments from your experience, is there a particular template checklist that people should be using? So a little bit of word of advice needed, or guidance on that.
Good question. Yeah, I haven't seen anything personally relating to the mechanical services, but I shall do some homework, see if I can find that out. But certainly within the BEMS world, yes, we do have what we call a fit building survey, which would be a tick sheet that would advise on the systems that you have installed, any strategy changes you would need to do to meet this guidance. So in the BEMS world, yes, we have. Within the mechanical world, there must be something out there. I will do some homework and get back to you on that one, Peter.
Thank you, Steve. And again, if there's anyone part of our audience that might know anything further on that, please fire that in through on the questions bit. Again, this is where we do want your questions, comments and views. So if there's any of the experienced people on this call that I know of, we've got hundreds on this call, on this webinar, I should say. Please fire in any recommendations on that question. So Steve, I'll call time on this segment of the questions. Just to remind the audience, there are plenty of other Q&A sections to come up, so we may go back to some of those questions. So Steve, over to you to continue the presentation.
Okay, thank you. So indoor air quality. So this is the area that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that we've done in the past, but there's never really been any science behind it. So this next section really is relating to what are we going to be doing moving forward to improve the air quality, or certainly the monitoring of the air quality within the environments. So what we need to look at really is what can we feel and what can we measure? What can't we feel and what can't we measure at the moment? So if we were to look at this slide, typically, or obviously every BEMS system will have temperature control. It will have possibly CO2 control. That has been really important over the last few years, certainly within the education sector and within office spaces. And humidity, probably not so much now, but we used to do a lot with humidity. So these three elements are commonplace within a building energy management system. And if there aren't, they're very easy to retrofit. What we've never really looked at in any finite detail are what we call the volatile organic compounds and particles that are present in the air, but we can't see them, okay? And it's these particles and what we call volatile organic compounds that could possibly be carrying these viruses back through the return air ductwork, hence the reason that the governing bodies are saying we need to be removing as much of the stale air as possible and introducing as much fresh air. Okay, so we can introduce at this point in time better filtration systems, and we could then introduce disinfected UV sterilization systems to hopefully kill off even more of these viruses that can be present within the space. We mentioned temperature and humidity, so the typical set points that we would have in the UK of 21 degrees C and 50% RH are fine, and there's been some research into the effect of respiratory infections based on humidity. The key thing for me to take away from this, or for you, is this gives us a KPI. So we could set now a set point and saying if we're at 50% RH, that's a good place to be. If we start to drift and we go below 40% RH or above 60, we can change the status. We can relate that to a percentage of humidity quality, and we can do exactly the same with temperature as we always have done. So we can set limits. So we could flag alarms. So can you? I'm just seeing if you can hear me.
Yeah, we still hear you,
We can still
Steve.
hear you, Steve. Yeah, it's all good. Right, as we just wait for Steve to come back on, just to remind people that we have got some polls and questions coming up. So I just give it a few moments until Steve comes back on, if that's okay. If not, we might jump to the poll. I can see the slides of that. So Steve, you're back with us. Can we hear you?
Can you hear me now? I beg your pardon.
We can hear you, Steve. So I've done a bit of filling in just to remind the audience we're going to have poll and questions, and this just proves to everyone this is live. So this is the joy of doing live webinars. So just to prove for the audience. But Steve, hopefully you got to where you were and just continue from there, really, so we can hear you and see you now.
Right. Okay, that's great. Yeah, apologies for that. I just noticed that my audio had disappeared. So I'm not sure where we got to, but we mentioned the fact about the temperature and humidity within the UK is fine. So 21 degrees C and 50% RH would be an ideal place to be, and they would be the norm within the UK. So you jump onto the next slide, Peter, there. So what that gives us within the BEMS world is a KPI. So that will give us a set point here, or an indication. If we're sitting at 50% RH, that's really good, that's ideal. If we start to drift away from 50%, we go to 40 or we go to 60, this will give us then an indication that things aren't as good as they should be. And we can represent that, you know, below 40 or above 60 as a change in a percentage. We could change an indicator color to say that the norm has been drifted away, as we would do with temperature. So temperature set points, we would within the BEMS usually put limits, high and low limits, to say whether the temperature had drifted away. So that gives us our first two KPIs, temperature and humidity. Next slide, Peter, thank you. The one area that we haven't really looked at in any detail that we talked about were what we call the volatile organic compounds, okay, and the particle matter that is within the air. We do the temperature, humidity, CO2, and SIBSI said to us that if somebody coughs or sneezes, and they're even saying if just people talking can actually expel some of these very, very fine particles, you know, of infectious aerosol. It's these particles that are moving and traveling around the building and back through the ductwork within the building on these other elements that exist within the air. Okay, so if we put that into perspective, that's a human hair. That would be a typical grade of filtration, PM10. So that's removing the particle matter down to 10 microns. And the pink item on here would be PM 2.5, which is obviously a lot smaller. To put that into probably my favorite slide, that's pollen. The PM10 is pollen. We can't see it, but obviously compared to PM 2.5, it's a lot larger. And it's these particles that exist in the air, okay, that these other elements are hitching a ride on. Okay, so this is why these elements, if we filtered to that point there and removed as much as we could down to PM 2.5, we are going to be removing some of this. I said earlier on, I'm not an air composition expert. We aren't going to claim to be removing COVID or any other bacterial virus from the air, but in introducing greater filtration, we will be removing some of it. If we then introduce sterilisation after the filtration to remove any further, or again, as much as possible of this virus, again, we're doing our best and our damnedest to make the atmosphere, the air, as clean and as safe as possible. We'll go on to one more guideline. We mentioned a couple of times, this is a global matter. This is a global issue. This is India. So this is saying exactly the same thing. We know the size of COVID is 0.1 of a micron. They again are suggesting increasing the fresh air intake, greater filtration of 13 or above, and also recommending UV light sterilisation, the coils within air handling plants, or local UV lights in rooms that are unoccupied that we could run to clean the space. And again, they're saying that if we introduce this combination of greater filtration and UV sterilisation, we are doing our best, to counter these harmful contaminants that are present within the air. So back to you, Peter, for another poll.
Yeah, and as promised, Steve, so thank you, audience, and yeah, as promised, there is another poll. So hopefully you've seen the question in front of you. The question, my organizer behind the scenes has launched a poll, so I can see that's already coming in. So it was basically, are you confident in applying the REHVA and SIPSI guidance within your workplace? So I can see results coming in. So obviously, Steve, it'd be good to have your initial feedback once the results have closed, just to see what our audience's views on that are. So yeah, I'll just give it a couple more moments because I can see how many of you's voted. Not going to name and shame, do not worry. But yeah, still waiting for that to come in. So just give it a few more seconds. So thank you. Yeah, if we can close the poll, that's great. So as you can see there, Steve, we've got 52% of our audience, so just over half indicating yes, 37% not sure, and 11% no. So any first initial thoughts on that, Steve, in terms of some of the response back?
Okay, yeah, no, that's good. Again, that's a good response. We had a question, didn't we, a while ago about, would you be able to implement these changes? I think a lot of this is obviously down to sitting on webinars like this, where you understand that there is this guidance in place. For the knows and the don't knows, we've said a couple of times now, we can help and advise. Certainly, REHVA SIPS will be able to help and advise. So reach out, after this webinar today, if you're unsure and you do need to be implementing anything that I talk about or any of the guidance that's on there.
That's great, and I think thank you again, audience, for participating in the poll. And I love to go to the questions, because as already mentioned numerous times by my dear self, we are having a number of questions come in rapidly, so I'm trying to keep up to speed with them. But we have had a question in, Steve, linking to some of the guidance that's been recommended, operating my ventilation plant at 100%. So someone's indicated that all the guidance recommends operating my ventilation plant at 100%. However, the question has gone on to ask, won't this have an adverse effect on my energy usage? So I don't know if there's a response to that, really, in terms of the actual energy usage debate.
Yeah, this is always one of the questions, one of the two main questions that come through when I do this presentation. The easiest comment, really, looking at the guidance, is that at this moment in time, it's health over wealth. There's obviously a big push for all the carbon neutral, by 2030 or 2050. is the big cut-off date. So I think in the interim, just go by the guidance. If they're asking you to run your plant at 100% fresh air, then yes, everyone is aware it will have an impact on energy, but the guidance is saying more fresh air.
Great, yeah, it's from that. So I'm aware of time. I want to go through a couple more questions that have come in. Tim Gilbert says, hi, Steve. I'm hearing about UV sterilization systems within air supply ducts, and I'm interested to know how effective they are and how widely used in the UK. So your knowledge on UV sterilization systems within air supply ducts. So question there about how effective they are and how widely used in the UK. Is that something you could answer, Steve?
Okay, yeah, it's something I'll talk about in a short while. Again, I'm not an expert on the UV side of it, but we have experts within Honeywell that are already implementing the UV sterilisation. Certainly within aircraft is one of the main places at the moment. The ductwork solutions I'll talk about in a little while, and there is a lot of supporting documentation that I can share with anyone on this call. I could send it all through to Peter. It's not a sales pitch. It's about the technology and what the implications are of putting UV sterilisation, UV lamps basically within a ductwork.
One more question for this section, and again I will remind people that we have got a Q&A section towards the end, so we'll go back to some of the questions later on as well. But a question in from Simon, so thank you, Simon. Very practical question, and again I don't know the answer on this, Steve, but you may have the answer, I hope. Are UV disinfection systems and installers available during the lockdown periods to retrofit the existing ventilation systems? So a very pragmatic question there, but I guess it's linked to installation. Is this available now in terms of installers, or will that vary per region within the UK?
It will have to fall into whatever COVID restrictions are put in place on buildings. I do know of this being implemented within London already, where because the building's empty, it's actually made it easier for mechanical engineers, electrical engineers to get on site, again under strict COVID rules and regulations to retrofit the filtration and UV sterilisation systems. So it would again be site-by-site basis, but again, if you've any specific needs or requirements relating to it and you need any guidance, let me know.
No, thanks, Steve. And again, thank you for viewers, listeners sending their questions in. Again, as promised, there will be a Q&A section again, and another poll, you'd be pleased to know. So Steve, over to you in terms of your next section of the webinar today.
Okay, so to put this into what I would say is probably my world, is to put this into an air handling plant. We talked about the sensors that would be readily available. So temperature, humidity, CO2. The chances are that your systems are definitely going to have temperature. Most systems will have CO2. And I say humidity, there was more humidity control and measurement probably 15 years ago, but these are very, very simple, commonplace elements that we would measure either in the ductwork or within the space. So what we're now doing, we're introducing these new sensing devices. So we're looking at PM 2.5. We talked about the size of the particle matter, and we're looking at the TVOC sensing. So we're looking at currently space, but we will be following that with a duct sensor. And we're also looking at combined what we call in these indoor air quality sensing devices that will measure everything. So temperature, humidity, CO2, PM 2.5, TVOC. So these would be quite simply, added to a room, whether that room's got a main, ventilation plant serving it, or it's just a standalone boardroom. Even opening the window within that room is going to have an effect on that air quality. And it's the fact that the BEMS will be recording and looking and using the information, the data that we get from these devices, relating those to REHVA, the SIBSI, the ISHRAE guidance, who will tell us the acceptable levels. And so it's these devices that are new. These devices are things we haven't looked at for enhanced air quality. So if we were to look at putting these within the ductwork on an air handling unit, for example, we have enhanced filtration, we've introduced the UV sterilisation. If we're to measure the supply air, and we can compare that with the outside air, we can automatically identify the effect that these devices have had. Now, I have an application in London where the ventilation plant's got fixed dampers. It hasn't got recirculation. They will run at 80% recirc, 20% fresh air fixed. So obviously their concerns are we can't run at 100% full fresh air. What do we need to do? So what they've looked at doing is implementing filtration on the return air, and again, then monitoring that return air and looking at the quality and the cleanliness, this particle matter within that return air compared to outside air, compared to fresh air. So it gives us then a lot more of the end, a more enhanced idea of the quality of the air, and we know that the particles that are in the air could be carrying the viruses around. If we implement local UV devices or local cleaning devices within this space, it will have an effect on these sensors, and we within the BEMS will be able to monitor the effect that we've had by implementing them. So we're calling it improved air quality. This would be your typical example of what we have now. We could look at occupancy, whether that came off the lighting system or it was directly linked to the BEMS, the temperature, humidity and CO2. So that would give us an idea of the air quality as it stands. If we look to enhance this and we start to introduce this CO2, PM2.5 and TVOC, measuring within a boardroom or within a classroom or anywhere, as we say, if we introduced even local air purification devices, obviously the UV lighting wouldn't be on while occupants were sat underneath it. So regardless of whether it was the main plant or not, it's this recording and measuring that is the key piece behind the initiative that we're looking at the moment. Filtration, I'll talk about pretty quickly, but basically these would be your typical panel filters within an air handling unit. PM10 we talked about, so this is removing the larger particles. We can go to PM5. If we start to introduce finer filtration with physical filters, this will have an effect on the airflow. This goes back to the mechanical engineers doing the risk assessment, looking at the plant and looking at the impact of putting different filtration in there. You may all be aware of what we call HEPA filters. These are used in clean rooms, in operating theatres, quite expensive, massive pressure drop, very difficult to retrofit. Again, Honeywell have introduced these electronic air cleaning devices. So basically they charge the particles that come in through that filter with a positive charge. We then have carbon rods on this side that attract those positively charged particles and remove them. The good news with that is that this filtration system's only got a 60 Pascal pressure drop. So it really has no impact. It could actually be more efficient than these filters, okay? We then talked about UV sterilisation to kill off any bacteria that may get through that filter. We're talking about COVID being 0.1 of a micron. We've only filtered down to 2.5 microns. So the bacteria is the piece that I know Tim asked on one of his questions. I can get a lot more data on what these devices do. But what we're saying there, if we introduce this filtration and UV sterilisation, we are removing as much as possible out of that air. These can be retrofitted quite simply. We mentioned that, is it being done at the moment? These devices are standard ductwork size devices. We can measure and monitor what's happening with the filtration systems. They have automatic cleaning modes on them. And the UV sterilisation, we would go on the science of, you know, how many meters cubed, you know, would rely or would need how many lamps and tubes. That would be calculated. Really the only big thing we would need to know on there is hours run, and that that unit is running. If it's running, it should be achieving what the design says it will do. I'll quickly mention critical spaces. This is what we call the Venturi valve, predominantly used within clean rooms and within operating theatres, where we're looking to maintain a positive pressure within the system. Again, if anybody wants any more information on that, then please ask away, and we'll share as much data as we like. This is very specific to labs, clean rooms, fume cupboards, and environments like that. But again, that is linked into the BEMS to give very, very strict pressure control. I'll talk very quickly over the Honeywell side of this, which is the access and the security piece. So this is looking at the people movement, people tracking. So we're already implementing temperature screening. I'm sure, you know, we've been into shops or places before the second lockdown where you've had your temperature checked. We can automatically check somebody's temperature when they enter the building, link that through to the security gate or through to the door. So if this person's temperature is exceeded, we can stop them entering the building. Frictionless access speaks for itself. This is obviously either using mobile technology or using a swipe card, so we don't have to actually physically touch a keypad. People counting and secure access, again, if we go to B&Q at the weekend, they'll count 2 people in and 2 people out. We can do that automatically, and we can relay this information onto this healthy dashboard, which I'll talk about in a few more minutes. So this screening technology is already there for temperature screening. It has had some issues that obviously if this guy's just run from Costa Coffee, his temperature could be over, but at least it gives us some time then to let him sit down and cool down. This is all already being implemented as we speak. Using the CCTV technology, we can count people in. An analogy of this would be Aldi. Aldi have actually linked their doors to the amount of people that go in. I don't know if anybody's seen that. So once they're up to capacity, they can shut the doors, put a red light on outside, and they won't let anyone else in. What we could also do is look at PPE detection. So we've now got software where we can check if this guy's not wearing a mask and masks are appropriate within that facility. We can identify he isn't wearing a mask, and this guy could intervene and say, where's your PPE? We can look at social distancing. If we come into work on a Tuesday and we feel fine, and then Wednesday we phone and say, I've actually got a temperature, going back through the CCTV and tracking where this guy's been throughout the day, we can actually track who we may have spoken to, the areas that he's been in, implement some cleaning regimes, and obviously advise anyone who's been in contact with to get a check or make sure that they're okay. So this is, you know, live. We're hearing about this all the time. Again, if anybody wants any more information on that, you know, this relies on the Honeywell security access people. Another poll, over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Steve. Just waiting for my system to reboot itself, but I'm back. So yeah, we've got our final poll, ladies and gents, in terms of the third poll, and hopefully you can see that. I can see my esteemed colleague Sheila and Nicole in the background that are launching the poll, so thank you, ladies, for doing that. So the question here is, have you already implemented any appropriate strategy changes? And as you fill in that poll in, I'm aware of time. We have indicated 1 o'clock to finish the webinar, but we may go a little bit over today, purely on the amount of questions we've got in, and obviously the content, but just to make viewers aware that the recording will be made available. So I do appreciate that some of you may have a hard finish that till 1 o'clock, but we won't go over for too long, but I just thought I'd make viewers aware. As host, I'm fully aware of the time. So just waiting for a couple more seconds for you to come in with your answers, which they are coming through now. So looking very positive, Steve, at the moment. So can I ask the poll just to close, if that's okay? Thank you very much. So you've got 3/4 of the audience indicating yes, 19% it's in progress, and I was going to say only 6%, but important, 6% have said no. So again, first reactions on that, Steve, any surprises on that, or again, was that to be expected?
No, that's great. And this is, I say, bearing in mind, this started back in March. I know I deal with some universities that have implemented, they spent quite a while implementing these changes. So it's good to see that people have been presumably using the BEMS to change the control strategy to meet the requirements. I think moving forward, we're going to have pandemic strategies built into specifications and built into systems. So we have a summer, winter, pandemic mode that we can automatically put any of the plants in place. But that's good that people are already implementing it. Again, if anybody needs to implement anything else, then please let me know. Again, it's all based on that guidance that REHVA and SIBSI are issuing.
So Steve, I'm aware of time. We're going to just move on to the checklist here, if that's okay, and then we're going to go to a Q&A session at the end. So I'll let you go into the points that you mentioned earlier about healthy building dashboard. So over to you. Okay,
so there's literally just a couple of slides left here. So we talked around what we can do or what we're now starting to implement, and what we really need to do is to relay that information either to the front of a building or to the FM manager, so that somebody's got an understanding of what's happening. So what we can do then is we can rate this. We could rate it as good, better and best, or we could rate it as a percentage. And the percentage route is the way we've gone, but that is defined by the user. Whatever you wanted to see, whether it be a traffic light system or a good, bad, better indication, doesn't really matter. But obviously the more things we implement, so if we had temperature, humidity, CO2, and we'd implemented these strategy changes, we could rate that and say this is this is good. If we start then to look at your CO2 and your TVOC, we can start to improve and increase that. And then if we implemented everything that we're looking at within this initiative, we'd have even more data to work on and use moving forward. Dashboard wise, this would be a manned dashboard in my mind. This is the Honeywell Access Security one. So obviously if somebody isn't wearing PPE or someone's over temperature, it's going to need some physical intervention, but we can report and record that on the dashboard. In the BEMS world, we could look at utilising, most office buildings will have a television screen at the reception. We could relay the health of the building onto that screen. This is what we're looking at. This is built into what we call IQ Vision, which is the head end, the supervisor that we currently have within Trend. And what this is doing, it's rating each of these zones with the sensors installed against the guidance. We now know what we can put in here relating to those pollutants. The guys that have developed this are talking with the likes of ISHRAE and REHVA, so that we're making sense of being able to report the air quality within a space. So quite a lot to take in today, and I say, if anybody wants to know more, please get in touch with me. So very quickly, the last slide. So what have we got already? The enhanced air quality piece, we talked about the pressurization, the ventilation strategy changes, temperature, humidity, CO2 is something that we do. Air composition is the key one, that we have now got these devices in place, and we can look at the filtration and UV sterilization. So that will give us the BEMS solution. Safety and security, again, is the Honeywell piece. This is your CCTV, access, etc. Again, any more info, please get in touch with Peter. That finishes my formal presentation.
Thank you, Steve. And it was a heck of a lot to go through. We appreciate the hour, and we have had questions come in. And funny enough, in that section, which I know we bypassed, funny enough, there are a couple of questions that were linked to how you can show your building health status, and obviously you went into the final section of your presentation today. So we've got some questions coming through, and I'm just to remind the audience, I'll try and go for as many as I can, but we will pass the questions on to Steve and we can get back to you post-webinar. We've got a question here from Sanjay. How can we ensure that there's nil effects of UV lights? So a bit of a health question in from Sanjay.
That would be down to obviously where the lights are installed. What I will do is I'll circulate all the data sheets relating to the science and the safety relating to that UV sterilisation system. I'll admit, it's not something that I know about 100%. I do know they are being implemented. I went to the dentist the other week. They had a standalone system that got filtration and UV sterilisation in there. It's obviously, we can't just go willy-nilly put in UV lamps in spaces or in ductwork without the science behind it.
Thank you. And there's a couple of questions that link to that health, so it'd be good if that could be shared. We've got a question in from Tony. Thank you, Tony. Are there any studies that show the cost of installing UV versus the energy savings by reducing the fresh air requirement? So are there any studies you're aware of, Steve, that answers that question?
I'm desperately waiting for these studies to come through, because as I explained, there's a company or a government body been put together called RAMP, who have identified the implications of the Northern Hemisphere being affected, that we cannot be running plant at 100% fresh air because the heating plant's not been designed to do so. I had the issue in the summer where the cooling plant is designed to run at 70–80% recirc. What we're trying to get and understand and get some feedback from SIBSI and REHVA is that if we do implement the monitoring of the air quality and we can prove that the air that is being returned or comes back up the duct is better than the outside air, if there's a way of reintroducing more recirculated air, this goes back to the reasonable words in the SIBSI recommendation. Still work in progress. I'm waiting. I'm being asked every time I present this for case studies because clients are concerned that they are just adhering to the regs at the moment. So yeah, as soon as I know more, or if anybody on this call finds out more and can share a case study with me, that would be really, really useful.
No, thanks, Steve. It's always difficult as some of this tech's moving quicker than some of the science behind it as well. Got a question from Chris. Thank you, Chris. And I was waiting for this. It's one of the issues that does come up when we talk about tech in particular and some advancements is how does GDPR come into play with the CCTV face tracking, and how does it effectively track users when half of their face is covered by a mask? So I think it's more about the detail about some of the CCTV aspects around sensors.
Yeah, this can always get complicated. I don't know much about that side of the business. I know we had what was called a vector app, which was an app that linked onto your phone. And yeah, GDPR people tracking is something, certainly within universities, students don't want to know, they want somebody following them, Big Brother watching them. So again, I'll try and get some data and detail on that. But that will fall into the security side of Honeywell. So I'll see if I can get some answers. Personally, I don't know. I wouldn't like to comment, but yeah, I can see the implications of it.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I guess GDPR is always going to be an issue with particularly the privacy elements of sensors generally and tracking when you've got that. A pragmatic question from Ian, but do understand it. Some of those sensors you mentioned, are these sensors wireless or hardwired, or is it a mix of both?
The sensors are hardwired. So the duct, the first range of PM 2.5 and TVOC sensors are active sensors, so they are 0 to 10 volt, 4 to 20 milliamp. The combined sensors are Modbus, so there'll be a lot more data available from those sensors, but they are hardwired. they're not wireless.
Okay, great. And I'm going to take one more question, and it's from Prasad K. So sorry if, well, from Prasad K is what I've got on my Asker system here. Is what is the alternate measures we should go and take if we have any technical glitches in all these software applications set up? He goes on to say, I mean, in terms of CCTV monitoring, thermal scanning.
Again, I would have to pass you back to the access and security people for answers to that one.
So again, anything linking to glitches and that would be mainly dealt with that side of the respective
Yeah, I would
business.
say, yeah, I presume you mean if it's detecting somebody's got a high temperature and they haven't, or anything like that, then there must be measures in place to rectify or to address that. But again, what I can do is get as much data as I can and contact detail for people within that part of the organisation, the access and security place.
That's great, and thank you for those listeners, viewers that did send their questions in. And as promised, and as already mentioned, I know I will send those questions that couldn't get answered today on to Steve, and I know some of them will need to be forwarded on because of the nature of the questions that we did propose today as well, Steve. Just finally, if you could do a 20-second wrap up, Steve. Obviously, from an hour presentation, that's difficult, but what does the future of healthy buildings look like moving forward then? I know you've touched upon some of the tech, but is this about adopting? Is this about awareness? What are the biggest barriers, challenges you think when it comes to healthy buildings, or have we overcome those hurdles?
It's still something people are talking about. There's a big link between there's obviously lots of talk about well-being. I see the future moving forward with enhanced air quality being key within well-being, and the way that we're linking lighting as well into these systems. There's been talk of thick building syndrome being linked to air quality. So personally, I believe, moving forward, there will be more, it will be probably better specified, would be the way of putting it forward, that looking at air quality, the composition of air, not just CO2 is always really the most important one, but I think looking at the composition of the air moving forward is going to be key in designing plant. Whether they're going to implement changes to actual physical design of plant, this will all be based on cost. We can't just suddenly go put a chiller on just in case we have another pandemic. But the questions to be answered. But I do think it will change. But I do think building occupation is going to change as well. I don't think there's going to be the same 9 to 5 clock on clock off office environments as they were before all this lot happened. We don't know. It's all new. It's all new to everybody. Sure, so I think we just want to get rid of this awful virus and see what the new normal is for everybody.
Yeah, indeed, and thank you again today, Steve. I've got a couple of closing slides to finish today's webinar, but I just want to say a massive thank you to you. This is very difficult, obviously, one, being live, and you're a sole presenter today, so I think you've done a stellar job, in my humble opinion. We will ask our audience that as well, so that's my closing slides. But that was Steve Rainbow from Trend. I want to just say a massive thank you again, Steve, for running through that presentation today. So as promised, just a couple of closing slides for the audience. We're nearly there. We've got our own resources on IWFM that are keeping us up to date on the coronavirus 19 and return to work. So ever-changing environment we're working in, and particularly lockdown in England. So yeah, please look out for the advice on our website in terms of COVID-19. And as I say, that has regular updates. Worth pointing at this point, this is where we house our guidance research reports, as well as the episodes of our Navigating Turbulent Times series, which this episode will be shortly on our website. Also, just want to make the point that we are developing a guide with Trend to follow on from this webinar around healthy buildings, and that's going to be launched early part of next year. So for our audience viewers, please look out for that. We're going to have some guidance building on today's webinar. So please look at the Insights Hub. There's a lot of wealth of information on there for members and non-members, I hasten to add. Again, a familiar screen on our NTT episodes. We love to see your case studies or stories. Please send them in relating to NTT or the world of FM and workplace. Please send them into that email address there if you've got any case studies or information you'd like to share. We're always wanting to hear feedback from our members and non-members, I hasten to add, that are on this webinar. Also, speaking about feedback, we are going to send a survey out post this webinar. That's not just to rate today's webinar, is to really build on future webinars as part of our series, and that's what essentially we've done. We've listened to our members, we've listened to our audience that have attended the 28 episodes, which today's episode was number 28, and we've built our program of webinars around the feedback, so i.e. what our members and what our audience want. So please fill in that survey. It does only take a couple of moments. And lastly, just to the audience for joining us today on today's live webinar. Again, BMS systems in terms of healthy buildings, an intriguing webinar that you heard from Steve. That was a lot of detail, information, reference, knowledge, guidance. The polls were enlightening in terms of the knowledge base today on the episode and where everyone's at different levels, and we appreciate that. So again, look out for episode 29. That's next week. That's going to feature our going to be recently launched and will be next week's launched guidance with Microsoft. Again, continuing the debate around technology. So please look out that. That's going to be next week's episode 29. So that's going to be at the same time. So thank you once again, and take care, everyone, and hope to see you soon on our next episode. So thank you again.